Tonight, we will journey together through one of the oldest and most fascinating collections of stories ever told. These are the myths of ancient Greece, tales that have passed down through centuries, whispered around firelight, painted on pottery, and carried on the lips of poets. Yet, as we explore them, we will do so gently, slowly, like wandering through a quiet garden at dusk, pausing to notice each flower, each stone, each detail along the path. Greek mythology, at its heart, is a great tapestry of stories, woven together over thousands of years. It is not one single book, not one single voice, but rather a collection of many different tales, told by different people across villages and cities, mountains and islands. Imagine the land of Greece itself, a landscape of rocky hills and olive groves, small fishing boats resting on the shore, and villages nestled among valleys where shepherds tended their flocks. Life was not always easy there. Fields were dry, summers hot, winters windy, but people looked up at the sky, at the sun and the stars, and they saw meaning in everything. They saw gods in the wind, in the sea, in the storms, in the harvest. To them, the world was alive with stories, and those stories gave shape to life. To begin at the beginning, as many did, we step into the quiet of creation itself. In the earliest Greek myths, before the gods we may know by name, before Zeus, before Hera, before Athena, there was chaos. Not chaos as we might think of it now, not confusion or disorder, but a wide, empty space, a kind of openness that stretched without end. Out of that space, the first beings appeared. Gaia, the earth, solid and fertile, the ground beneath all things. Then came Nyx, the night, dark and deep, and Eros, love, gentle and binding, a force that drew things together. In the quiet imagination of the Greeks, the world began not with war, but with these simple presences: earth, night, love, and sky. From Gaia came Uranus, the sky, and together they became the first pair, the union of ground and heavens. And from them, the first generations of beings were born. These early figures were called the Titans, and their names still echo softly across history: Cronus, Rhea, Oceanus, Hyperion, and others. They were vast, almost beyond comprehension, not quite human, not quite gods, but something ancient and immense. Life in ancient Greece, as these myths were told, was full of simple patterns that echoed these stories. A family might gather around the hearth in the evening, sharing bread dipped in oil, or honey poured over cheese. The children would listen as an elder told of the Titans and their children, not as far-off legends, but as familiar companions, forces that shaped the wind in the olive trees, or the waves breaking against the shore. Storytelling was as much a part of life as tending goats, or mending nets, or weaving cloth. And so, through these stories, the Greeks explained not only the origin of the universe, but also the cycles of their own daily lives. The rising of the sun was Helios driving his golden chariot. The harvest was Demeter's gift. The storms at sea were the anger of Poseidon. To speak of myth was not to escape reality, but to live within it more deeply. As the tales continue, we hear of the Titans themselves, who were mighty but not eternal. Uranus, the sky, feared the power of his children, and so he tried to keep them bound. But Gaia, the earth, longed for freedom, and she encouraged her children to resist. Among them, Cronus rose up, and with a great sickle, he overthrew Uranus, taking his place as ruler of the cosmos. Yet even Cronus, in time, grew fearful of his own children. One by one, as his wife reared them, he swallowed them whole, so that none could take his throne. But Rhea, longing to save at least one child, hid away her youngest son, Zeus, and gave Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling cloth instead. Cronus swallowed it without noticing, and Zeus was spirited away to a hidden cave on the island of Crete. There, as the story goes, he was raised quietly, nursed by a goat, and lulled to sleep by nymphs, while the sound of clashing shields hid his cries. It is a story told not with alarm, but with a kind of inevitability, the sense that cycles of birth and change move gently forward, just as seasons turn. And as we think of those ancient listeners, sitting under the stars, we can imagine the way these myths felt to them, not like distant legends, but like a mirror of their own world. For every family had its struggles between parents and children, its worries about harvests and storms, its hopes for renewal and protection. Zeus, the hidden child who would one day free his siblings, was a reminder that even in times of fear, there could be change. Cronus, who swallowed his children, reflected the ways power can cling too tightly. These were not just gods in the sky, they were patterns of life itself, told gently, in the rhythm of story. And as the night deepened, and the fire burned low, listeners would drift into sleep, carrying the voices of the gods into their dreams. And so, from that quiet cave on the island of Crete, the hidden child Zeus grew strong. In time, as the stories tell, he would rise against his father Cronus and free his brothers and sisters, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, bringing them into the light once more. Together, they became the Olympian gods, those familiar names we hear even today. Their dwelling place, it was said, was high above the mortal world on Mount Olympus, a mountain that reached up into the clouds, where snow-capped peaks and cold winds wrapped around it like a crown. Of course, no mortal had seen them there, but the thought of the gods above, living in halls of marble and gold, feasting, speaking, and guiding the world, gave a sense of closeness to the divine. It was not a fearful closeness, but one of presence, like knowing that the sun would rise again in the morning, or that the moon would shine softly at night. Zeus himself was imagined as the king of the gods, but also as a figure both protective and stern. He was the keeper of justice, the one who carried thunderbolts, yet he was also a fatherly figure, someone who watched over the order of the world. His brothers and sisters each found their place in the order of things, not as rivals now, but as guardians of different realms. Poseidon, ruler of the sea, was imagined with a long beard and a trident, stirring the waters that fishermen and sailors knew so well. Hades, quieter and less spoken of, ruled the underworld, not as a place of torment, but as the land of the dead, where all souls eventually rested. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen, watched over marriage and family, her presence often tied to the hearth and the union of households. Demeter, gentle and steadfast, was the goddess of the harvest, her moods reflected in the growth of crops and the cycles of the seasons. Hestia, goddess of the hearth itself, was perhaps the most familiar of all, for her presence was felt in every home, in every fire that warmed a family through the night. Life in Greece was full of reminders of these deities. Each meal began with a small prayer, each journey with a small offering. A sailor might toss a bit of wine into the sea, whispering to Poseidon for calm waters. A farmer might leave the first fruits of the harvest to Demeter, thanking her for her gift. In the city, temples rose with tall columns and wide steps. But in the countryside, a simple stone by the roadside could serve as a place of reverence. The gods were everywhere, not distant but woven into the patterns of daily life. When a storm rumbled across the hills, it was Zeus speaking. When the olive trees bore their fruit, it was Athena's blessing. To live in Greece was to live in a world of constant conversation with the divine. Athena, daughter of Zeus, was one of the most beloved among mortals. Born, the stories say, from her father's own head, she arrived fully grown, clad in armor, a goddess of wisdom and strategy. Yet she was not harsh or unfeeling. She was also the protector of cities, especially Athens, which took its name from her. To walk through Athens was to feel her presence in every stone, every marketplace, every school where knowledge was shared. She was a goddess of clarity, of thought, and of invention. Beside her, Apollo shone brightly, the god of light, music, and prophecy. His temples, especially the great sanctuary at Delphi, became centers of gathering, where people from every corner of Greece came to seek guidance from the oracle, the priestess who spoke in his voice. Imagine the hush of that place, the quiet of the mountains, the smoke of incense rising, the soft murmurs of pilgrims waiting for words that might shape their lives. Artemis, Apollo's twin, moved with a different kind of grace. She was the goddess of the hunt, the forests, and the moon. To those who lived near the wild places, she was both protector and guide. Children might whisper prayers to her at night, asking her to keep wolves away, or to bless the deer that wandered the hills. Then there was Aphrodite, goddess of beauty and love, whose presence was in every smile, every glance, every moment of tenderness between people. She was often imagined rising from the sea foam, radiant and serene, her influence gentle but powerful, for even gods and kings could not resist her. As stories of these deities grew, they were not told as stern commandments, but as tales, living and breathing. They explained why the seasons changed, why the sun moved across the sky, why love stirred in the heart, or why storms raged suddenly across the sea. The myths were soft explanations of life's mysteries, wrapped in the language of story. For those listening in the evening, whether a farmer's child on a hillside or a sailor resting in a port town, these tales were companions, not distant rules. They made the world feel known, even in its vastness. And yet, the gods were not imagined as perfect beings. They quarreled, they loved, they erred, just as mortals did. This was perhaps what made them so relatable. Hera might be jealous, Poseidon stubborn, Apollo proud. Zeus himself was often portrayed as a figure of strength, but also of desire, seeking love in many places. These flaws did not diminish the gods. Rather, they brought them closer, showing that even divine beings mirrored the struggles of human life. In this way, the myths carried lessons, not through direct instruction, but through reflection. They taught patience, humility, cleverness, or caution, simply by showing the stories unfold. To picture life at that time is to imagine a balance between the ordinary and the sacred. A family in a small village might spend their days tending sheep, weaving wool, baking bread. The children might play by the river, while their elders told tales of how the river was a god's gift, flowing down from the mountains. At festivals, people gathered with music, dancing, and offerings, honoring Dionysus, god of wine and joy, who reminded them of the sweetness of laughter and companionship. Lamps would be lit, songs sung, wine poured, and for a night, the distance between mortal and divine would feel very small. All of this, in its quiet way, formed a world where mythology was not a separate story, but the very rhythm of existence. To light the hearth was to honor Hestia. To plant seeds was to trust Demeter. To sail was to call upon Poseidon. The myths were everywhere, not heavy or frightening, but like a gentle presence, reassuring people that they were not alone in a vast and unpredictable world. And as the stars filled the sky, the same stars that carried names of constellations tied to these stories, people lay down to sleep, knowing that the gods watched above. As the myths unfolded across generations, the focus of the stories slowly expanded. The gods remained central, high upon Olympus, but now the tales began to weave in the lives of heroes, figures who were part divine and part mortal, whose lives carried echoes of both worlds. These heroes were not imagined as distant or unreachable. Instead, they were portrayed with struggles, choices, and journeys that listeners could feel in their own hearts. They represented courage and cleverness, but also doubt and weariness. Their adventures did not always end in triumph, yet their stories endured because they spoke softly to the human experience. To hear of a hero was to hear of one's own possibilities and limitations reflected in a mirror, shaped gently by the voices of storytellers. Among the most beloved of these heroes was Heracles, known later as Hercules to the Romans. His tale was one of strength, but also of endurance. Born of Zeus and a mortal woman, Heracles was blessed with extraordinary power, yet his life was not one of ease. He faced trials, not chosen freely, but given as penance for mistakes and misfortunes. The famous 12 labors became the measure of his resilience. One by one, he faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, slaying the Nemean lion with its impenetrable hide, capturing the swift Ceryneian hind, cleaning the Augean stables in a single day, and many more. Each labor was more than a test of muscle. It was a quiet symbol of persistence, of finding ways to move through the difficulties of life. For the listeners of ancient Greece, who themselves worked hard in fields, climbed steep hills, or braved seas, Heracles' labors carried comfort. If he could endure, perhaps they too could find strength in their daily struggles. Perseus was another figure who held a special place in these tales. His story is often remembered for his slaying of Medusa, the Gorgon with hair of snakes, whose gaze could turn a person to stone. Yet the telling of Perseus' life was not only about triumph, but also about guidance and help received along the way. He did not journey alone. Athena lent him her shield, polished to a mirror-like shine. Hermes offered his winged sandals. These details reminded listeners that even heroes required aid, and that wisdom and tools could matter as much as bravery. When Perseus finally succeeded, his victory was not only his own, but a collaboration with the gods and the gifts they provided. It was a soft reminder that in life, cooperation and gratitude were as important as strength. Then there was Theseus, the hero most closely tied to Athens, the city of wisdom and art. His story centered around the labyrinth of Crete, where the Minotaur waited in the darkness. The labyrinth itself was a symbol, a winding puzzle of choices and confusion, much like the challenges people faced in their own lives. With the help of Ariadne's thread, Theseus found his way through, slaying the Minotaur and emerging back into the light. For those who heard the tale, it was not only a story of courage, but also one of clarity and cleverness, of finding a guiding thread when life felt tangled. In the quiet evenings, parents might retell the story to children, encouraging them to remember that when life seemed confusing, patience and small steps could lead them through. Jason and the Argonauts, too, carried with them a sense of companionship and shared purpose. Their voyage for the Golden Fleece was filled with trials, encounters with harpies, clashing rocks, and strange lands. Yet the heart of their story was not only Jason's bravery, but the fellowship of many heroes together, rowing side by side on the Argo, for a people whose lives depended on the trust of neighbors, sailing in crews, farming in communities. This story spoke gently of unity, of how journeys are easier when shared. Around firelight, listeners might nod quietly, thinking of their own families and villages, and the strength found in working together. Achilles, the central figure of the Iliad, was remembered differently. His tale, shaped in Homer's epic, was not one of simple triumph. He was unmatched in battle, swift and strong, yet his story was filled with questions of honor, choice, and mortality. His famous heel, his single point of weakness, was a symbol that even the greatest among men were never invincible. For sleepy listeners hearing these tales, perhaps after a long day of toil, Achilles' story might have been a reminder that every person carried both strength and fragility. To accept both was to live wisely, neither boasting of one's power nor despairing in one's weakness. Odysseus, too, wandered through the hearts of many tales. His journey home from Troy, the Odyssey, was a story not of speed but of patience, as he faced storms, monsters, and temptations along the way. The gentle rhythm of his voyage, moving from one island to another, from one trial to the next, carried echoes of life's own meandering path. He met the Cyclops, Polyphemus, whose single eye was blinded not by strength but by cleverness. He faced the songs of the sirens, which he resisted by filling the ears of his men with wax and binding himself to the mast. These stories were not loud battles, but slow lessons in wit, resilience, and longing for home. For those who listened by lamplight, Odysseus was a reminder of the pull of family, of hearth, and of the hope that even long journeys would one day end in return. Even lesser-known heroes carried gentle wisdom in their stories. Bellerophon, who tamed the winged horse Pegasus, showed the value of courage balanced with humility. Orpheus, the musician who descended into the underworld to bring back his beloved Eurydice, carried with him the soft power of art and song, a reminder that beauty could move even the gods. His story, ending in loss when he looked back too soon, was not told to frighten, but to suggest the tender fragility of love and trust. Each story, whether of triumph or sorrow, flowed into the larger tapestry of Greek mythology, where the boundaries between human and divine blurred gently, like mist across a hillside. What made these hero tales so enduring was not only their adventures, but their closeness to daily life. A farmer might see himself in Heracles' labors, bending his back to plow the fields. A child might see in Perseus the courage to face small fears, whether of darkness or storms. A sailor might see in Jason's voyage the companionship of crewmates. A parent might feel in Odysseus' longing the same yearning when separated from family. These stories, while grand in their details, were never far from the hearth, the marketplace, or the fields. They were not told to stir battle cries, but to settle the heart, to weave meaning into the fabric of ordinary days. And so, as listeners drifted towards sleep, the heroes of Greek mythology walked gently beside them, not as distant figures of legend, but as companions in thought. Their journeys were mirrors of life's quiet challenges, their victories and sorrows alike offering reassurance that every struggle had meaning, every path had its guiding thread. In the soft rhythm of these tales, the world seemed less overwhelming, more familiar, and filled with voices, divine and human alike, that kept watch through the night. As the stories of gods and heroes drifted through the evenings of ancient Greece, another layer of myth rested always in the background, the stories of what lay beyond life. For the Greeks, the underworld was not a place of fire or endless torment. It was quieter, softer, more complex. It was the land of Hades, the god who ruled there with his queen, Persephone. To speak of Hades was not to speak of evil, but simply of inevitability. All mortals, whether kings or shepherds, whether joyous or weary, eventually walked the path downward into his realm. It was not feared so much as accepted, like the setting of the sun at the end of the day. The journey into the underworld was often described in careful, almost poetic detail. When a soul left the body, it was guided by Hermes, who in addition to his role as messenger was also the gentle conductor of souls. He would lead the spirit to the banks of the river Styx, where the ferryman Charon waited. Charon was said to carry souls across the dark waters, but only if they had the payment of a coin, often placed in the mouth of the deceased by their family. This custom reflected the care of the living for the dead, a quiet reassurance that loved ones would not make their journey alone or unprepared. For those listening by lamplight, the idea was comforting. Death was not sudden disappearance, but a passage, accompanied and observed. Once across the river, the soul would enter the realm itself. The underworld was vast and varied, not a single place but many, each reflecting different aspects of existence. There were the asphodel meadows, a wide plain where most souls wandered, neither punished nor rewarded, but simply continuing in a kind of gentle twilight. There was Elysium, a brighter and more peaceful place, reserved for the most virtuous, where heroes and poets might find endless rest. And there was Tartarus, deep and shadowy, where those who had greatly offended the gods might face their punishments. These divisions were not told to frighten so much as to explain, to give shape to the mystery of what followed life. For the Greeks, the afterlife was not an unknown void, but a landscape they could picture, described softly in story. The presence of Persephone added another layer of meaning to this realm. Her story was one of cycles, of loss and return. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and the myth told how Hades carried her into the underworld to be his queen. Demeter, grieving for her daughter, let the earth grow barren, and winter fell. Eventually, an agreement was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year below and part above. Her return each spring brought blossoms, grain, and renewal, while her descent each autumn brought quiet and rest. This myth gently explained the turning of the seasons, but it also comforted listeners with the idea that even separation was not final, that loss could be followed by reunion. In a land where crops and seasons shaped survival, the story of Persephone and Demeter was not only myth, but a rhythm of daily life. Other tales of the underworld painted its paths in more detail. There were rivers beyond Styx, Akron, the river of woe; Lethe, the river of forgetfulness; Phlegethon, the river of fire; and Cocytus, the river of lament. To drink from Lethe meant to forget, to release the memories of a past life and begin anew. This idea soothed the thought of rest, that the burdens of life, its worries and pains, could be washed away in gentle forgetfulness. The underworld was thus not simply a place of endings, but of transformation, a slow unwinding of earthly weight. For the Greeks, the rituals surrounding death carried quiet meaning. Families would place coins with the body for Charon, wrap the deceased carefully, and lay them to rest with offerings. There might be simple wreaths of laurel, a cup of oil, or small possessions meant to accompany the soul. These acts were not grand gestures, but small signs of care, moments of love continuing beyond life. To speak of them in story was to remind the living of the bond between generations, a chain unbroken by death. Around the fire, listeners might feel reassured. Just as they honored those who came before, so too would they be remembered and guided when their time came. Some stories of the underworld featured figures who ventured down and returned. Orpheus, with his lyre, descended to bring back his beloved Eurydice, enchanting even the stern Hades with his music. Though his attempt ended in sorrow when he turned too soon to look at her, the tale carried tenderness. It showed that love could reach even into death's domain. Heracles, too, descended as part of his labors, bringing the hound Cerberus, the guardian of the gates, back to the surface. These journeys did not portray the underworld as unreachable, but as part of the great cycle, accessible to those with courage or need. They reminded listeners that death was not a wall, but a passage in the larger story of existence. Even in their everyday lives, Greeks felt the presence of these underworld myths. The cycle of planting and harvest mirrored Persephone's descent and return. The lighting of lamps during festivals connected them with Hades and the ancestors. Families might speak softly to their departed loved ones, leaving offerings at graves or shrines, knowing that bonds stretched beyond the visible. In this way, the underworld was not distant. It was woven into life, not with fear, but with familiarity. To imagine the underworld in the quiet of night was to picture a place of shadows, yes, but also of peace. Wide meadows where souls wandered gently, silent rivers reflecting the dim light of unseen skies, the steady presence of Hades and Persephone, watching over all with calm dignity. It was not a place to dread, but a continuation, a slow journey into stillness. And for those lying down to rest, hearing these stories by fire or candlelight, it must have felt like a reflection of sleep itself, a gentle letting go, a surrender to the dark, with the promise of return when the morning came again. And so, as the stories of Greek mythology wove their way through centuries, they formed a great circle, beginning with chaos, flowing through the birth of the gods, the lives of heroes, the quiet journeys into the underworld, and returning again to the rhythms of daily life. To the people of Greece, these were not simply tales of the past. They were the language of the present, a way of understanding the world and its mysteries. Each myth, whether of Zeus on high Olympus, Heracles in his labors, or Persephone moving between worlds, was like a thread in a vast tapestry. The tapestry was not meant to be hurried through or finished, but rather to be gazed upon slowly, each part adding depth and color to the whole. To listen to these stories, then, was not simply to be entertained, but to be soothed, reminded that life itself is a story, unfolding with patience and meaning. The gods, in their many forms, reflected the variety of human life. There were gods of wisdom and war, of hearth and harvest, of sea and sky, of laughter and of sorrow. No part of existence was left untouched. This inclusiveness gave the myths a gentle reassurance. Whatever one felt, joy, grief, confusion, or hope, there was a story that mirrored it. A fisherman staring out at a calm sea might think of Poseidon in a gentle mood. A mother tending her children by the fire might feel Hestia's presence at the hearth. A farmer scattering seed across his fields might recall Demeter's gift, trusting in her cycles. And in each case, the myth was not separate from the act, but folded into it, like breath folded into the body. The heroes, too, carried lessons that were never loud, but always clear. They showed that strength could take many forms: Heracles' endurance, Perseus' reliance on help, Theseus' cleverness, Odysseus' patience. They reminded listeners that life's challenges were not to be feared, but to be approached step by step, with courage and humility. In hearing their stories, people found quiet companions for their own struggles, whether those struggles were as simple as climbing a hill with a basket of olives, or as complex as facing loss and change. The heroes walked beside mortals in memory, making life's burdens feel lighter. The underworld myths offered their own kind of comfort. To know that Persephone would return each spring meant that winter's barrenness was never final. To know that souls crossed rivers, guided and cared for, meant that death was not chaos but transition. To hear of Orpheus's music or Heracles' descent was to feel that even the deepest mysteries were not beyond touch. These stories softened the fear of endings, making them part of a larger rhythm. Just as the sun sank each evening and rose again each dawn, so too did the soul journey, rest, and renew. For those lying in the quiet of night, such thoughts must have brought peace, a gentle reassurance that life and death alike were cradled in meaning. Even the land of Greece itself seemed to echo these myths. The mountains rose like thrones of the gods. The seas stretched out like Poseidon's domain. The olive groves whispered of Athena, the vineyards of Dionysus, the grain fields of Demeter. Each place was touched by story, and each story by place. To walk through Greece was not only to move through hills and valleys, but through myths come alive. A traveler could look at a cave and imagine Zeus hidden there as a child. They could see a river and think of Lethe or Akron. In this way, the landscape itself became a gentle book of myths, open to all who wished to read it. Over time, these stories were written down by poets, painted on pottery, carved into stone. They traveled beyond Greece, carried by traders and conquerors, whispered into new lands. Yet even as they spread, they retained their softness, their timeless rhythm. Today, when we recall them, we do so not only to learn of the past, but to connect with the same quiet wonder that once filled the nights of ancient listeners. To hear them now is to sit again by the hearth, to feel the flicker of lamplight, to imagine the stars above shining on both gods and mortals alike. And perhaps this is the greatest gift of Greek mythology, that it reminds us of the closeness between story and life. Myths are not separate from us. They are the patterns we live each day, shaped into gentle tales. They are the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, the labor of the body, the longing of the heart. They are reminders that we are never alone, that our joys and sorrows are part of something larger. To listen to them is to rest within that larger story, to find calm in its unfolding. So now, as we come to the end of this journey together, let your mind settle like a ship finding its harbor. The gods are at their feasts on Olympus, their laughter echoing faintly above the clouds. The heroes rest in their legends, their journeys complete. Persephone walks once more among the flowers, Demeter smiling at her side. The underworld is still and quiet, its rivers flowing gently in the dark, and the stars above shine steadily, the same stars that watched over Greece long ago, and that watch over you now. Allow yourself, too, to rest within this tapestry. Feel your breath soften, your body sink into the comfort of where you lie. There is no hurry, no labor, no burden here, only the gentle rhythm of stories, ancient and eternal, carrying you like a river into calm. As the voices of gods and heroes fade into the distance, let their quiet presence remain, a soft assurance that you are held within the story of life itself. Close your eyes, drift with the current, and let sleep take you kindly, as it once took the listeners of old, beneath the same timeless sky.